Flashing red and blue lights danced across the calm surface of Lake Serenity as three fire trucks roared onto my property. I stood there beside my perfectly legal campfire, watching the chaos unfold with a mixture of amusement and disbelief. Karen Piton, president of the Maple Ridge HOA, stood at the edge of my property line with her arms crossed and a smug smile plastered across her face. She was wearing her signature leopard print jacket despite the warm evening, and her blonde highlights caught the emergency lights like a disco ball. Finally, she announced with a triumphant tone to anyone within earshot, "Someone is going to deal with this menace to our community." The firefighters rushed toward my small, contained fire ring, equipment at the ready. But as I calmly reached into my pocket and pulled out the deed to my land along with all the proper permits, Karen's expression began to change. What she didn't know yet was that this deed contained more than just property lines. It included something that would turn her world upside down. My name is David Morrison, and 3 months ago, I purchased this beautiful 5-acre lakeside property just outside the boundaries of the Maple Ridge subdivision. After 25 years working in corporate finance, I wanted a place where I could unwind, maybe catch some bass, and enjoy the simple pleasure of a campfire under the stars. The property came with an old cabin that needed work, but the real selling point was the private beach and the peace it promised. The first few weeks were a paradise. I drive out from the city on Friday evenings, light a fire in the stone ring the previous owner had built, and watch the sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and purple. The property was technically outside the HOA jurisdiction, separated by a narrow strip of county land, but close enough that I could see the backs of the nearest houses. That's when I first encountered Karen. She appeared one evening like a wraith emerging from the shadows, marching down to the shoreline with a clipboard and a scowl. "Excuse me?" she called out in a shrill voice. "But you need to extinguish that fire immediately. We have strict regulations about open flames in this community." I explained politely that I wasn't part of her HOA and showed her my property markers. She huffed and puffed, but eventually retreated, though not before taking several photos with her phone and muttering about investigating further. Over the next few weeks, Karen's harassment escalated like a symphony building to a crescendo. She started with passive-aggressive notes left on my truck windshield whenever I parked near the public boat launch. Then came the visits from various concerned neighbors, who all seemed to parrot the same talking points about fire safety and property value. I later learned she'd been recruiting them at HOA meetings, painting me as some sort of pyromaniac, threatening their suburban paradise. Despite having all the proper permits from the county, including fire safety clearances and environmental assessments, Karen refused to back down. She began documenting every fire I lit with timestamp photos, creating what she called her evidence file. I even caught her trespassing one evening, measuring the distance from my fire ring to the nearest structure with a laser measure. "This is exactly 73 feet from the Johnsons' shed," she declared, as if she'd uncovered some great crime. When I pointed out that the Johnsons' shed was on their property, not mine, and that my fire ring exceeded all requirements for my land, she simply sniffed and said she'd be looking into the regulations more thoroughly. The breaking point came on a beautiful Saturday evening in July. I had a couple of friends over for fishing and a barbecue. We were sitting around the fire telling stories and enjoying the night when suddenly the peaceful atmosphere was shattered by sirens. Not just one emergency vehicle, but 3 fire trucks, an ambulance, and 2 sheriff's deputies came racing down my private drive. Karen had called 911 and reported an out-of-control wildfire threatening multiple structures. And she'd even convinced a few neighbors to call in supporting reports, creating the illusion of a major emergency. As the firefighters rushed toward us with hoses at the ready, I couldn't help but notice Karen standing at the property line, filming everything on her phone. Fire Chief Robertson, a no-nonsense man in his 50s, quickly assessed the situation. He looked at my contained fire ring, the cleared area around it, the bucket of water and shovel I kept nearby, and then looked back at his crew with visible frustration. "Sir," he said, approaching me with a weary expression, "we received multiple reports of an uncontrolled blaze. Can you explain what's happening here?" I showed him my permits, the safety measures I'd taken, and explained the ongoing harassment from Karen. Chief Robertson's face grew darker with each detail. False emergency calls waste resources and can cost lives when real emergencies occur elsewhere. As the chief was documenting everything, I mentioned something that made him pause. By the way, Chief, you might want to note in your report that this property includes the deed to the old Morrison well system. It supplies water to about 15 homes on Maple Street, including Mrs. Piton's house. The chief raised an eyebrow with interest. The Morrison well? I thought the county managed that. Common misconception, I replied, pulling out a folder I'd been keeping in my truck. It's actually private infrastructure that was bundled with this land purchase. The previous owner had a handshake agreement with the neighbors for free usage, but legally, I own their water supply. Karen, who had crept closer to eavesdrop, suddenly went pale beneath her spray tan. That's impossible, she sputtered. We've been using that water for 20 years. 20 years of generosity from the previous owner, I corrected her calmly. But given tonight's events and the ongoing harassment, I think it's time to formalize the arrangement. The next morning, I contacted my attorney, James Fletcher, who specialized in property law. After reviewing the deed and associated documents, he confirmed what I'd suspected. The well system, installed in the 1950s by the original Morrison family, had remained private property through every subsequent sale. The informal agreement for free water access had no legal standing. Within a week, official notices went out to all 15 homes on Maple Street. The letter was professionally worded, but clear. Water access would now require a formal agreement and monthly usage fees. The rates I proposed were reasonable, actually below market average, but the principle was what mattered. Karen's reaction was volcanic. She showed up at my property the next day with 2 other HOA board members, waving the letter like a declaration of war. This is clearly retaliation, she shrieked, her face red with rage. You can't hold our water hostage because of a few complaints about your illegal fire. My fires are perfectly legal, as the fire chief confirmed, and I'm not holding anything hostage. I'm simply exercising my property rights just as you've been exercising your perceived authority over neighborhood matters. She threatened to sue, to contact the media, to expose me at the next town council meeting. I welcomed her to do all of those things, knowing my legal position was rock solid. What she didn't realize was that her pattern of harassment, including the false 911 call, had been thoroughly documented by the sheriff's department. The legal battle that followed was brief but decisive. Karen hired an attorney who quickly advised her that she had no case. The deed was clear. The water rights were mine, and her history of harassment actually weakened any claim she might have had for maintaining the status quo. Meanwhile, the sheriff's department had opened an investigation into her false emergency reporting. At the September HOA meeting held in the community center that ironically relied on my well for its water fountains, Karen faced a reckoning. The false 911 call had become common knowledge, and homeowners were furious about the potential water fees that her vendetta had triggered. Margaret Davies, the HOA treasurer, stood up during the public comment period. Karen, your actions have put our entire street at financial risk. We're now facing monthly water bills because you couldn't leave well enough alone. One by one, residents voiced their frustration. The very people Karen had recruited to complain about my fires were now turning against her. The meeting grew so heated that the vice president had to call for order multiple times. When the vote of no confidence was called, it was unanimous, except for Karen's own vote. She sat there stunned as her carefully constructed kingdom crumbled around her. The woman who had ruled the neighborhood with an iron fist for 5 years was officially removed from the HOA board. But the consequences didn't stop there. The district attorney's office, taking the false emergency reporting seriously, filed charges. Karen faced up to 6 months in jail and fines up to $5,000 for knowingly making false reports that dispatched emergency services. At her court appearance in October, Karen stood before Judge William Hartley, no longer the confident queen of Maple Ridge, but a deflated figure in a conservative pantsuit. Her attorney negotiated a plea deal, 3 years probation, $5,000 in fines, and 100 hours of community service, specifically with the fire department to understand the consequences of false emergency calls. When Judge Hartley read the sentence, Karen's jaw dropped. $5,000, she gasped, her voice barely a whisper. The judge fixed her with a stern look and reminded her that she